Well, the transfer portal giveth and the transfer portal taketh away. I think that's a theme that has applied to this LSU football program and other LSU programs, especially this year. So many players leaving through the transfer portal, but also a good bit of the roster being acquired through the transfer portal. Now, that begs the question, which transfer portal addition can make the biggest impact for LSU football this season? We'll break that down, plus so much more, on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to check us out on your preferred podcast platform, as well as YouTube as well. If you hit that subscribe button, then you'll be notified as soon as the podcast drop, and you won't miss a single second of your Locked on LSU content. But today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. I'm Caroline Fenton. I'm your host, as I am every day. I'm an LSU graduate, and I now do sports talk radio for ESPN 102.5 The Game in Nashville. But there are some big changes in college football. I think we all know that. And I would say most notably, NIL is the biggest change that we've talked about, especially over the past few months, since it is so new and since it's grown so massively. We've talked about it plenty here on the podcast about how it's going to change the future of recruiting, how it'll change the future of college football. Will NIL change anytime soon? I think those are all very fair questions to ask, especially considering that this time last year, NIL didn't exist. And now it's the biggest story in college football. It's one of the biggest stories in sports. But I think with NIL, when you talk about the changes of college football, the transfer portal often gets overlooked because it's been around long enough that it feels like this has just been part of college football forever, when in fact it really has not. And it's changed so much of how college football works. I mean, without the transfer portal, what does 2019 look like for LSU? Without the transfer portal, there is no Joe Burrow at LSU. So when you think about it in that context, at least just on a microcosmic scale of just 1 year, just one player at LSU, it has changed things so massively. So the transfer portal, while NIL is a huge change, while NIL completely has shaken up not just college football, but college sports as a whole, I don't think that we pay enough attention to the transfer portal and just how much the transfer portal has changed things. But in terms of the transfer portal, things could be changing for itself down the line. Now, it was just released a few days ago by Heather Dinich at ESPN that the NCAA's Transformation Committee, which whatever that is, but Greg Sankey is a co-chairman of it, along with Ohio Athletic Director Julie Cromer. So the NCAA's Transformation Committee, I'm assuming that means just a committee that looks at things that can be changed. Greg Sankey likes that. But on this past Thursday, they announced recommendations. So this is not anything that's going to be written into law. This is not anything that's going to be written into NCAA guidelines. These are just recommendations. So they're bringing it up of, this is something that we've been thinking about, and then the rest of the NCAA can vote on it from there. So we just want to preface it with that. This is not a new rule. These are not written in stone. There's been no pen to paper. This is simply just discussions that they've been having, but I'll continue. The recommendation is that it would provide athletes with windows to enter the transfer portal each year. So there's other things that they're considering on changing. We'll get into that later on this week, because I do think that some of these other changes they're proposing are relevant to college football or relevant to LSU. But I want to focus in on the transfer portal today. So the recommendations would mean that there would be specific windows of when athletes can enter the transfer portal. Now, we talk about the Wild Wild West a lot, and we talk about NIL being the Wild Wild West, since there are so few, if any, regulations and guidelines. And the transfer portal isn't much different. As it is currently constructed in the transfer portal, you have to enter by May 1st of every year. So you don't necessarily have to transfer by May 1st. You at least have to notify, let's say, I'm Caroline Fenton, LSU football player. I don't want to play at LSU next year, and I don't know where I want to go, but I know I want to leave. By May 1st, I need to make that decision that I'm leaving, and then after then, I can decide where I'm going to go. So the movement is not limited, but you must notify schools and you must enter the transfer portal by May 1st of each year. That currently is the only guideline that exists for the transfer portal for every sport, not just football, for every sport. So what these transfer portal windows would do is open up specific time periods where, this is your green time, this is your good to go time to enter the transfer portal. And then after that time is up, the portal is closed, this mythological creature of the transfer portal. So what is the point of this? Why do they want to do this? According to the Transformation Committee, Greg Sankey included, of course, the commissioner of the SEC, says it's intended to stabilize the transfer environment, and it would require additional accountability for schools that receive transfer students. So stabilizing the transfer environment. I don't know if it would stabilize things, or I don't know if it would just more so control things. I think that the NCAA and a lot of these commissioners are feeling very, very out of control with the way that things have changed and the way in which they did it so rapidly. So changing the transfer portal guidelines or changing the timeline of when you can enter the transfer portal would control that a little bit. It would ensure that players aren't just entering the transfer portal and leaving and going all over the place. And, it would just at least calm down the transfer portal a little bit. And it would at least make the athletes a little bit more accountable and giving them more of a deadline. It would hold them a little bit more accountable. Now, I do have kind of an issue with this because the timelines that they have been proposing are pretty short windows. So Todd Berry, and this is not from the Transformation Committee, but this is something that was brought up by Todd Berry, the executive director of the American Football Coaches Association, said last month that the window that he at least was considering is the final Sunday in November until the early signing date in mid-December. So you're looking at about half a month. And then the other window would be from April 15th to May 1st. So also about half a month, 2 weeks-ish. So I have a problem with those windows. Do I have a problem in general with the window? No, because I do kind of think that the transfer portal is great. It is the Wild West. But those windows are so tight. Those windows are so short, and it would limit the amount of time that you would have to be able to look around, and it would limit the amount of time that you can transfer barring anything happening. So let's say your coach gets fired and gets hired by another school, and you want to go to that school. You want to enter the transfer portal and go to that school now and start kind of creating your roots in that place and, establishing yourself at that school. Well, if the date of your coach's firing doesn't land in those two windows, then you're stuck there until the next window is open. I think it's targeting more so, the players that just enter and re-enter more so than it's looking at what I think is the norm of transfers, at least in college football. And that is, well, I'm in spring camp and I don't see a starting spot for myself here. I haven't started yet and it's game 6 and I want to start. I want to go somewhere where I can start and I want to transfer now. My coach was just fired in the middle of the season and I want to transfer. These new transfer portal windows, at least as it was proposed by Todd Berry, which is not going to be from that is not from the Transformation Committee. That's not what it is going to be. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But just those windows that have been proposed, I think are far too tight. And I don't think that gives the athlete the benefit of the doubt to be able to find where they need to go or want to go. But I do like the idea of the school that would receive a transfer student requiring additional accountability. Now, what exactly is that? It wasn't specified by this Transformation Committee. And what exactly does that mean? I don't know. But I do think that providing a very supportive and welcoming environment from a school that is receiving a transfer is important. So, and especially now that you're dealing with NIL, are those additional resources? Is that a group of people, an advisor for academics, an NIL advisor? Is that a buddy that you're assigned to on the team? I don't know. What does that look like? Just ensuring that these athletes, when they do transfer, they're taken care of, especially in an age of college football where things are totally up in the air and things are totally changing. And as we're navigating it, these 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds are navigating it as well. And it's their life, it's their future. And that can be pretty overwhelming. And when you're entering a new school, perhaps a new coaching staff, perhaps a completely new system, you're dealing with a lot. So I don't know what is currently in place. It probably differs from school to school what's currently in place for their transfer portal player protocol. But establishing something that's kind of uniform across the board, I think is a good thing. So there's part about this that I do like. There's part of it that I don't like. But they will continue to kind of mull over this, and they will vote on the new transfer portal recommendations. They'll chat about it at the June 30th meeting. And if it does support them, then it'll go to the D1 Council for feedback at their July 20th meeting, and it could ultimately be approved by August 3rd. So within the next fewer than 2 months, this could be in effect if it does pass those two meetings, but we'll keep an eye on that. But coming up next, we're talking about so much about the transfer portal. It's something that LSU has both benefited from and also, I don't like using the word victim of, but let's just use it, has been a victim of, especially over these past few months. What do the transfer portal additions mean to LSU, and which transfer portal edition can bring the most value to this LSU team in 2022? I'm going to get into that coming up next. But before I do that, I want to tell you that betonline.net is your number one source for all of your sports betting needs and sports information. You can find all the latest sports developments. They've got league reviews and news. I've got this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball. If you've been following the NHL playoffs, it's been a pretty wild 3 games so far. Colorado currently up 2-1. Tampa Bay came back last night, had a big win, and they are still alive. So game 4 will be tomorrow on Wednesday. So make sure to tune into that. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information. They've got live betting, they've got esports and scores. They've got so much on betonline.net, and they're the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your sports and events. They've got MMA, boxing, and golf. I mean, talk about shake-up in the game of golf. Oh my goodness, with the LIV tournament coming up. And they've got players going from the PGA to the LIV tournament. What does the future of the PGA look like? All of these questions are kind of up in the air, but it'll be really interesting to see how that affects the betting markets. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Again, I'm Caroline Fenton. I'm your host, as I am every day. You can follow me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. Also, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Locked On LSU so you don't miss a second of LSU content. But we're chatting about the transfer portal and how there could potentially be changes coming up with the transfer portal windows, and changed protocols for schools that give and receive transfer portal players, which at this point is every institution. But LSU has gotten the most transfers, football at least, the most transfers of any other school in college football. So who exactly can make the biggest impact for this LSU football team via the transfer portal in 2022? So 24/7 Sports put out an article about, who can be the biggest impact transfer for every D1 school. So of course, the first place I looked was LSU. And honestly, before I even clicked on the article, when I just read the headline, I thought, oh, Jayden Daniels. It seems obvious, right? A transfer quarterback coming in, competing for the starting job. And of course, you can make the argument, well, if he doesn't win the starting job, then he has no impact. But I would actually turn around and beg to differ, because Jayden Daniels obviously coming into LSU via the transfer portal from Arizona State. I look at that and think, let's say Miles Brennan wins the starting job. Let's say Garrett Nussmeier wins the starting job. Jayden Daniels coming into LSU created a lot of quarterback competition. So, I don't know exactly what that looks like in practice. I don't know what their quarterback meetings look like. I don't know what their day-to-day quarterback competition looks like, but I can only imagine that adding Jayden Daniels into the mix, a player that has a ton of starting experience, a player that had a stellar season in 2019, of course, taking a step back over the past couple of years, bringing in a talented quarterback with a repertoire or with talents that are so different from Garrett Nussmeier and Miles Brennan, I would say makes an impact whether he wins the starting job or not. And then let's say he does win the starting job. He's your starting quarterback. So of course he's going to be the most impactful transfer portal player. So I was a little bit surprised when I didn't see Jayden Daniels' name next to LSU as who could be the most impactful transfer portal player. Instead, 24/7 Sports lists Jarek Bernard-Converse defensive back. So this is what the article says. It says LSU completely overhauled its defensive back room after it was decimated via injury in 2021. The Tigers also lost their top two corners in Eli Ricks, transferred obviously to Alabama, Derek Stingley Jr., of course, to the NFL draft. Fortunately, they get a corner in Bernard-Converse, who started 47 consecutive games in 4 years at Oklahoma State and learned from one of the game's best defensive minds in Jim Knowles. Now, a couple things that I want to break down there. Jim Knowles, great defensive coordinator. Oklahoma State had the 5th-ranked defense in college football in 2021, for sure. I don't know if I would go as far as to say is one of the best defensive minds in college football, but that defense absolutely was very talented this past year, so I'm not going to take anything away from them. I feel like a lot of the national talking heads, and I want to preface this by saying I don't disagree with this. I just have thoughts on it. I think that a lot of the national talking heads or a lot of the national college football writers, people who don't cover LSU on a day-to-day basis, I think maybe misinterpret the loss or maybe overestimate the loss of Derek Stingley Jr. Of course, when you lose a player like Derek Stingley Jr., it's going to hurt. It absolutely. I mean, 3rd player taken overall in the draft. He's a dude, and he was a huge contributor to that national championship season. But LSU hasn't had a 100% Derek Stingley Jr., hasn't had a consistently out there on the field and being able to produce Derek Stingley Jr. since that 2019 season. So yes, that cornerback room is losing Derek Stingley Jr., not just his ability, but also his leadership and his expertise, and that will be a big loss. But I feel like maybe this article overestimated that loss because it's not like LSU is going from having Derek Stingley Jr. on every down in every single game and consistently producing to just not having him, to losing him to the draft. LSU's been without 100% Derek Stingley Jr. for the good bit of the last 2 years. So while this defensive back room needed more depth, more experience, and more veteran players, 100% totally agree with that. I don't want to get it twisted that losing Derek Stingley Jr. leaves this massive hole that has just been created since the draft in late April, because that's something that LSU's been dealing with for quite some time now. Doesn't take away the need for a defense back or for additional corners. Just saying this isn't anything new. But I'll continue. I don't disagree with that at all. Because Jarek Bernard-Converse doesn't just bring experience, but brings Power 5 experience, brings experience in the Big 12, brings experience with a team that went to the Big 12 championship, brings experience with a great coach in Mike Gundy, brings experience that has postseason experience. He's played, the article listed at 47 consecutive starts. Those are all invaluable things. A veteran player who's been out there, who has been proven to be able to be consistent. He doesn't get injured. Your best ability is your availability. And Jarek Bernard-Converse absolutely has been that for Oklahoma State over the past 4 seasons. So I don't disagree that he can make a massive contribution. But I think the biggest thing that this article highlighted was the need for defensive back depth. So I look at this and I ask myself, why not Greg Brooks Jr.? He's another 3-year starter at Arkansas. So, you have someone who has SEC experience. If we're going to talk about, being a veteran player and being, playing against some of the top teams in the country, Greg Brooks Jr. has done that for the past 3 years at Arkansas. Now, he doesn't have the 47 consecutive starts that Jarek Bernard-Converse had at Oklahoma State. And of course, Jarek Bernard-Converse has a year on Greg Brooks Jr. He had 4 seasons at Oklahoma State. And Greg Brooks has 3 at Arkansas. But he started in 2021, 13 games, all of their games plus the bowl game, 2020, 9 games, 2019, 11 games as a true freshman. So that's 33 starts over his past 3 years at Arkansas. I would say that brings the same kind of veteran-ness that Jarek Bernard-Converse plays, and also competing and in a more difficult league in the SEC. I think there's a good bit of value to that. I also look at Makai Garner, who was a 2-year starter at ULL. I mean, no, he was all Sun Belt in 2021, and no, Sun Belt is not even nearly as difficult as the SEC or the Big 12 for that matter. But that's also a veteran guy coming in who can add a lot of depth to this cornerback room. So while I totally agree that the cornerback room, the defensive back room as a whole needed more depth and it needed more experience, I wonder why Jarek Bernard-Converse is the one out of those three. And I would really probably narrow it down to Greg Brooks and Jarek Bernard-Converse. Why is it Jarek Bernard-Converse that 24/7 Sports thinks can make a bigger contribution? I mean, I would love for both of them to make a massive contribution. But I do wonder, what about Jarek Bernard-Converse does 24/7 Sports find so valuable over Greg Brooks Jr.? And you can even expand beyond the cornerback room. I look at a defensive lineman in Makai Wingo, who transferred to LSU from Missouri. He was an SEC all-freshman team. He had 27 tackles this past season. Yes, that Missouri defense was absolutely atrocious, but I would say Makai Wingo was the golden star, golden child of that defense. So what can he do alongside Ali Gay, alongside BJ Ojolari, alongside Mason Smith? This defensive line will be an absolute force in the trenches. So will they look into that and say, no, this guy doesn't have as much experience. He's not a 3 or 4 year starter at an SEC or a Big 12 school, but he's a guy that was highly touted out of high school, is a 5-star recruit coming out of high school. And the addition on the defensive line of just another big-bodied, very powerful guy who is proven to get tackles as a true freshman at Missouri, going up against some really stout offensive lines in the SEC. Why can't he make the biggest contribution? So I don't disagree. I think Jarek Bernard-Converse brings something incredibly valuable to this LSU team. But why him over other players? That's my only question. But coming up next, we talk a lot about the transfer portal in football. But how is the transfer portal affecting another team at LSU? I want to get into that coming up next after we hear from some of our sponsors. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. So I got to let you know that the one live NBA draft show is not enough for Locked On. Nope, we've got plenty more. The entire NBA channel is going live on NBA draft night. So if you have a favorite NBA team, if you're a big Pels fan, or if you just want to see where Tari Eason or where some of these other former LSU players go, make sure that you subscribe now to the Locked On YouTube channel so you get notified when they go live on NBA draft night. That'll be a fun night. And I'll be sure to tune in to Locked On's NBA draft night coverage. But the transfer portal giveth, the transfer portal taketh away. We chat about how it's impacted LSU football, but as of late, it's very much so impacted LSU baseball as well. I mean, it has been a busy past few days for this LSU baseball team, because now eight LSU baseball players have entered the transfer portal. And the craziest thing is, they're probably not done yet. There's probably a few more dominoes that are set to fall. So the latest of the LSU baseball players that have entered the transfer portal is Will Safford, latest player to leave LSU. He made 6 total appearances this season. He's a local kid, Baton Rouge kid. He went to U High. It was always his dream growing up to play for LSU, but just didn't see a spot for himself in the future at LSU. But he joins Giovanni DiGiacomo, Collier Cranford, Brody Drost, Anthony Priester, Michael Fowler, Brennan Holt, and Alex Brady, who have all entered the transfer portal as well. And a majority of those names are probably not names that you have heard before or haven't heard very often. And that's for a very specific reason. And I want to establish this to anyone who might be panicking and thinking, oh my gosh, all of these LSU baseball players are leaving. They're all, they're unhappy with the Jay Johnson era. Jay Johnson's not doing a good job, so on and so forth. Before the panic sets in, before the anxiety starts to set in about the future of this LSU baseball program. These players are entering the transfer portal because they don't see a roster spot for themselves moving forward. LSU is the top recruiting class coming in the 2022 season. So if there are these players that haven't seen the field much, haven't started many games over the past year, 2 years, even 3 years, in Giovanni DiGiacomo's case, 4 years, if they're not seeing the production out of themselves, and if they're not seeing the playing time or the roster spot that they want, then you go elsewhere. You go find another place where you can play, because they're looking at this recruiting class coming in and they'll be fighting for roster spots. So it's not about the program or the culture or it's going downhill, press the panic button. No, don't do that. Do not do that. It's simply because these players don't see roster spots for themselves because there's so much talent coming in. Now, this next month-ish, maybe a little bit less, is going to be a very confusing and strange time for LSU baseball because they don't know exactly who from that recruiting class is going to make it to Baton Rouge. The MLB draft starts on July 17th. It's actually my birthday, so happy birthday to me in the MLB draft. Starts July 17th through the 19th, I believe. And it's very likely that that's probably not all, but several of these LSU recruits won't even make it to campus because they'll get drafted and they'll pursue a career in the MLB and just skip college. So LSU baseball and we won't know who is coming in out of that draft class. So we and LSU baseball and Jay Johnson won't know who they have to fill these certain spots. Now, of course, you know of several returners, players who have decided to practice their eligibility. You know who they are going to be. But in terms of filling these roster spots, now 8 in the transfer portal, plus players that will go on to the MLB or have exceeded their eligibility, there's going to be 10 to 15 plus roster spots that are potentially open that could or could not get filled by the draft, just depending, by this recruiting class, just depending on who gets drafted. So it's going to be kind of a tough time to try and figure out, the talent that this team needs. But until then, they look to the transfer portal. And that's exactly what they've done, because I said that the transfer portal taketh away the 8 players that have already entered the transfer portal. And it also giveth. So it was just announced that LSU has also picked up Baylor starting shortstop Jack Panetta from the transfer portal. So this past season, he was batting .300. He had 15 doubles, 5 triples, 7 home runs. And then I look on the defensive side of things, and that's where I think things really get interesting. Because, of course, he was a starting shortstop at Baylor. He will be competing with Jordan Thompson for the starting shortstop spot. And I've said it on this podcast so many times, and I've said it on Twitter so many times, Jordan Thompson has been incredibly frustrating this past season, especially his defense. So I think that's what I'm really excited about, to have Jack Panetta in here, is to create some shortstop competition, because there were so many times over this past season. I saw it, I know you've probably seen it too, where it was just dumb fielding by Jordan Thompson. I look at Jack Panetta, who had 8 errors in 54 games, all Big 12 honorable mention. And then looking at Jordan Thompson, who had 18 errors, so over double the amount of errors in just 8 more games. So I'm excited to see how this shortstop competition heats up. If Jack Panetta does win the shortstop position, you could probably see Jordan Thompson move over to the third. But I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for all the way around. Jack Panetta can come in, come into a competition, really establish himself, get pushed a little bit. And Jordan Thompson the same way. This has been his position. This has been his spot that's now in question. So what is he going to do? How much harder is he going to work to be able to secure that spot? So I think it's a good thing. I mean, healthy competition is always a good thing. But of course, Jack Panetta, shortstop from Baylor, coming into LSU, and then 8 players on their way out. So we'll make sure to follow where those players go and how many more players LSU baseball can add into the transfer portal. But that is going to do it for me today. I appreciate y'all for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Coming up tomorrow, we will chat about the recruit of the week. That's our new summer segment. So we'll break down, who's coming into LSU, who is LSU interested in, and how can they make a difference for LSU football. I'll get into that coming up next. But the first picks of the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft have been made, so search now for Ultimate NBA Mock Draft and get over 50 insiders, the Odyssey sports experts, the draft experts of Locked On NBA Big Board. The 5-episode Ultimate NBA Mock Draft is underway, so make Ultimate NBA Mock Draft your second listen today.